Okay, we'll just give it another.
I think we're streaming on YouTube.
Yeah, we're also streaming on YouTube. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we have a very revealing program for you today featuring Canadian journalist Robyn Doolittle talking about her book, Had It Coming, Rape Culture Meets #MeToo, Now What? A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To pose a question at any point during this evening's event, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Had It Coming. Robyn's an investigative journalist for the Globe and Mail, which is a national newspaper in Canada. Before joining the paper 7 years ago, she already had made a name for herself as a dogged reporter at the Toronto Star, where her coverage of Toronto's mayor, Rob Ford, helped expose his addiction to crack cocaine and led to his downfall. She went on to write a book about the mayor, Crazy Town. In the summer of 2015, Robyn began investigating how police handle sexual assault allegations and discovered, among other revelations, that nearly 20% of such cases, an excessively high number, were being dismissed as unfounded, a term used by police to indicate their belief an accusation was either false or baseless. Robyn's reporting resulted in an award-winning series called Unfounded that prompted a review of thousands of cases, a reopening of some, and a national overhaul of policy training and practices related to sexual violence. Her book, Had It Coming, is an outgrowth of her newspaper reporting. Originally published in Canada 2 years ago, the book examines the systemic barriers affecting the ways sexual assault cases are handled. A review in Kirkus called the work a balanced consideration of a timely issue. And other reviewers have praised the lucid conversational tone, informed view, and nuanced analysis that Robyn brings to what is a complicated subject. Conversation with Robyn will be an old buddy of hers, Daniel Dale, now a reporter in CNN's Washington Bureau, where he fact-checks political claims. Prior to joining CNN 2 years ago, Daniel spent over a decade at the Toronto Star, where he overlapped with Robyn and later did a stint as the paper's Washington bureau chief. So Robyn and Daniel, screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to start with a disclosure note. You've taken some of it, but yeah, Robyn and I have been friends for 15-ish years now. We were at the Star as interns together, covered Mayor Ford together. Robyn was my inspiration for getting my little Pomeranian because she had the cutest Pomeranian named Chester, who I fell in love with. I think we might have a breezy cameo.
I hope there's a breezy cameo to start.
This was requested. This is not me. This was requested by Robyn. This is Breezy. Okay, thanks, Breezy. You did great.
Good job, Breezy.
All right, that was a breezy part.
It's good to just ease into this conversation because it's a heavy topic.
It's heavy. Pomeranians make everything.
Pomeranians help.
But so I'm not going to try to ruin your career with some sort of trick question tonight. But I have actual questions for you because Robyn is such a busy woman that I honestly do not think that we have ever had a real conversation about this excellent book you wrote. And I think the first question that came to mind for me was, I remember when you got the book deal or you agreed to write this and you knew it would be a Me Too book, but didn't quite know what form it would take. And you write early in the book that one of your options was to lean into your anger as basically a woman living in the world and dealing with what you have to deal with. But that after some consideration, you decided that was not the book you were going to write and you would take a different approach. So what was your thought process about the kind of book that you wanted to write here?
Yeah, we never actually did talk about it because someone moved to Washington and I don't get to see. Yeah. So yeah, as Bradley mentioned, I spent something like 2 years really deeply entrenched in reporting on sexual violence and understanding how these specific cases are handled in the context of the criminal justice system. And about 8 months after my series Unfounded ran, the Me Too movement broke. And in the year after that, we were, discussing, like, was there a book here? And the thing that I was really interested in exploring is while doing my reporting on sexual violence, I realized that I myself carried so many of these biases and things I didn't understand about how trauma can impact behavior and kind of play into some of these rape myths. And that's where I got really interested in, like, maybe there is something here that's worth kind of unpacking more in the book form. But at the same time, when I actually sat down to try to write it, I couldn't decide on which route to take, because I, of course, have lots of stories that I thought were worth unpacking. And, there's a side of me that is very angry, I think, as a lot of women are. And were, especially at this time. But ultimately, I thought there was much more value in exploring that kind of darker side that I myself was harboring some of these ideas. And I think I start the book with that example of Kobe Bryant. And as an adult, re-examining that case, doing book research, I thought back to myself when I first heard about that case, and the thoughts that I had at that time were very much of the, well, what did this young woman think going to a hotel room with an NBA player late at night, and that kind of victim blaming that I had, and I thought interrogating those ideas and really seeing where they come from would be a more interesting and frankly productive way to take the book.
Yeah, I thought one of the most interesting things was who you decided to give an airing to. As reporters, even when we talk about objective, like straight news reporting, we always have a choice about who we quote, who we give that space to. And one of the people you give space to is a judge in Canada who was basically kicked off the bench for making comments to someone who alleged sexual assault during a trial that were widely considered appalling. And I think a lot of people, like, feminist people in this movement, regular people, would say, like, I don't want to hear from this guy. Like, he was kicked off the bench for a reason. So why did you sit down with this man? Why did you give this man the space to explain himself?
Yeah, so in Canada, this case involving, as Daniel mentioned, Robyn Camp. He was a judge in Alberta, and it was a huge scandal here. He was the judge presiding over this sexual assault trial. It was a young Indigenous woman. She was really intoxicated at the time. And one of the questions that he asked her on the stand was, if you didn't want to be penetrated, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, why didn't you, sink into, because she was sitting on a sink when this allegedly happened. Why didn't you sink into the sink to prevent that? Why didn't you close your legs? For obvious reasons, I think it sparked a huge controversy here. And there were many other, problematic statements that he made, including about her alcohol and intake. And there was he was under investigation for judicial review, and he ultimately resigned before they could remove him. He'd never spoken out before, and I really wanted to talk to him. And frankly, I was really surprised that he agreed, and was delighted he agreed, because I think, again, if we're trying to get into the tougher discussions around Me Too, one of the big things is looking at people who have done harm in some way, and harm is a real spectrum, right? And being a judge presiding over that case is a level of harm, and also looking at, what do you do with people who want to do better? During the judicial review process, Robyn Camp talked about understanding where he had made mistakes. He did training with 3 professionals, one a trauma expert, another a feminist lawyer, or a feminist legal professional. He did extensive reviews of feminist legal theory and sexual assault law. One of the things that emerged, which I think was really interesting, is Robyn Camp was moved to the judiciary after a career as an oil and gas lawyer. He had almost no experience in criminal law, and the Canadian legal system is such that it is possible to go from a career of oil and gas to presiding over really complicated sexual assault trials, which is a really specific and nuanced area of law. So he didn't have hardly any training there. And he wasn't fluent in understanding how rape myths and stereotypes can permeate these types of processes and lead to victim blaming. And we can talk a little bit about what those rape myths and stereotypes are. But I just thought it was so important to hear from him, because he quite openly says, I was incredibly wrong. I didn't know about any of this stuff. I had no idea that a person who really strongly fears for their life can have a biological response that causes them to freeze, that causes them to have memory difficulties. I didn't think about power imbalances in that way. And so I kind of think, like, one, it's really crucial to hear from him and then make this decision of, well, how does someone who's in their 60s, he's this, white 60-something judge from South Africa, change his mind? Like, that's what I really wanted to know. What was it? I think we probably all have those people in our lives, the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving who you just try to ignore, spouting off random stuff. And how do you get to, crazy Uncle Bob? Well, I wanted to know from Robyn Camp, how did you change your mind? And also unpack, what do you do with him now? So you have this judge who has been disgraced with this scandal, but he's probably more educated than the vast majority of Canadian judges on sexual assault law now. And he was no longer practicing. And what do you do with someone who, like, what's the redemption question? So those were kind of themes that I wanted to explore. And if you're wondering what happened to Robyn Camp, is he was reinstated as a lawyer, but he is not a judge.
Did you find, you said you're wondering, like, how do you get to the crazy Uncle Bob, or how do you get to Robyn Camp? Like, find that there were generalizable lessons from his growth? What is there a moral of the research?
Yeah, for him, he said no one, when he was sitting down with these experts who were kind of taking him through the problems, they never actually said what the problem was. They gave him things to read. They had discussions with him, but they let him work it out for himself. He said that he never felt like they were judging him. It wasn't a matter of chastising him. It was, well, let's talk about, like, why it would be, or why are you asking if she closed her legs? What are you trying to get at with that question? Well, how does that bear responsibility on what he, or how does that deal with his responsibility? Why is it her responsibility? And getting him to talk through these things and doing a lot of reading. And he said that, for a long time, actually, he didn't really get it. He kind of kept circling back to, well, I was asking for a legal reason because of X, Y, Z. And they said, okay, keep reading. And they'd send him more articles and think pieces. And then finally, he says one day he went for a walk and it suddenly clicked, like, oh, I'm putting the onus on her to protect herself. I'm, asking questions that I think are legally okay, but are obviously going to cause great distress to her for no reason. And so those are things he came to naturally. I think in my own research, something that I've come across, and this a little bit dovetails with when I was looking into kind of how social media and the echo chambers that we all get stuck in on Twitter and the tribalism of politics these days is, I think it's helpful when you're talking to your crazy Uncle Bob or anybody to avoid certain phrases, because it signals that you're on a certain side when maybe you're not actually trying to do that. And you probably are on a side, but if for the greater good, you want to try to change Uncle Bob's mind, maybe don't talk about the patriarchy, but you can talk about the patriarchy without using that word. Rape culture is something I actually don't really say, when I'm talking with certain segments of the population, because I think it can trigger someone just to completely shut off, like, oh, this is just a a crazy left-wing feminist, boom, as opposed to actually getting into what rape culture is, which is, no, it's just the way that our society has existed going back millennia is built around this it's a male centric, white centric society, ableist, like you can go on and on. And those norms cause all these bad things when we don't interrogate them. And it's worthwhile to interrogate them and the power dynamics that are at play there. And in the context of sexual violence and sexual harassment, how those dynamics play out is often that perpetrators of harm are excused and victims are blamed. And one big moment for me when I was doing my Unfounded reporting at the Globe and Mail, I was covering a trial, and there was a young woman. She was out in our entertainment district, which is several blocks in Toronto that are just nightclubs. And she was out with friends, got separated, ended up at another bar. There's video cameras that show her kind of coming into the bar. A guy is pouring alcohol literally down her throat. You can see it on security footage. And about 15 minutes after she arrives, he's literally carrying her because she cannot walk out of the bar, brought her to a hotel and raped her. And it actually ended up in a conviction, which is frankly quite rare in these cases because these cases are so hard to prove. But because there was video footage in the elevator of her basically asleep against the wall, there are laws in Canada around your capacity to consent. If you're so intoxicated, you cannot consent. There is no consent. And so he was convicted. And I remember kind of watching the footage in the nightclub of this guy going like, what is like this person thinking? And around the time that I was covering this trial, I rewatched the movie, The 40-Year-Old Virgin. I don't know if you've seen it or not. But it was like one of my favorites when I was younger. And there's this scene where Steve Carell's friend is teaching him how to pick up women at bars. And he basically says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but within every man is an impulse to tackle drunk women at bars, like they're gazelles. And it's like, that was funny at the time. That's where people learn stuff. It's just normalized to the point where you don't even notice it.
Yeah. I thought another really interesting chapter was the one about Aziz Ansari. And I thought it was very, very Robyn of you. For those who don't personally know Robyn, I think people who know her see her as very frank, willing to say things that other people might be uncomfortable saying. But I was like mildly concerned reading that part. So for those who haven't read the book yet, Robyn, who's like known as, for her feminism, for her amazing reporting, that feminist support. But you write in this section of the book, like you heard this allegation about this famous, comedian, performer, actor, who's accused of misconduct on a date with a woman that he'd brought back to his home. And you say that you thought it was kind of meh.
I was like, I don't know what I think of this. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you go on to say that you asked some female friends about it, and they differed from you. Anyway, I was wondering, like, did you have any trepidation about revealing that view of your own, and why did you decide to go into this kind of debate between you and your friends?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of the challenge around these topics with Me Too is it's hard to talk about some of it, like to work through some of your thoughts, right? So whether we like it or not, like we all have these biases woven into us because, again, they are reinforced from the time that we're so young. And sometimes you need to talk things through to understand them. And the reality is, like, there is a spectrum right here. And I think so often things can, we're afraid to get into gray. I mean, I don't need to get into cancel culture or the problems with social media. We all know that, social media is a really difficult place to have conversations. And in fairness, words can do harm. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing necessarily, that we're all having to be really careful about the statements that we just put out into the universe. But with Aziz Ansari, for sure, I was, I texted my friends about when that story happened, I didn't tweet my thoughts, right? And my thought was basically like, is this just me, or is this not quite me too? Because as you recall, the story was this woman. It was a student named Grace, went on this date with Aziz, and they went out to a bar and came back to his apartment. And basically, she alleges he was badgering her for various sexual acts, and she would acquiesce, but she didn't really want to, but she didn't say anything. She acknowledges she didn't say anything, but she didn't feel great about it. And then she'd stop, and then she'd say no, and he'd stop, and then he'd kind of start again, and she'd, go along with it, and then didn't like it, but didn't say anything again. And then finally it was like, you're all the same. He called her an Uber. She went home. And on one hand, I thought, like, I think a lot of women can relate to this experience of being like, I don't really want to do this, but it's just easier than having a fight about it, which is messed up, but that's a separate issue. And yeah, I texted my friends this, and we had a really good discussion about, like, if he didn't want to have this problem, if he didn't want to be embarrassed in this way, then he maybe should have, treated her better. And why are you so concerned about Aziz Ansari? Like, Aziz Ansari is going to be fine. And ultimately, Aziz Ansari is fine. But yeah, I think on that one, and my friends and I had a great conversation, and I really came away from it with a more nuanced understanding of the situation myself, and had to interrogate my own views. But so I guess there's a couple of things there. One is, where is it a safe space to talk through these issues? And the other thing is, why do I think it's a little bit different? And I think this gets into something that I wrote about at length in the book, is about consent. And I really think so many of the issues that we see around Me Too and sexual violence comes down to the fact that people oversimplify consent. Consent is a difficult situation. And before everyone starts yelling, like, this is a reality. When you talk about consent, when you think of what you learned in school or heard of commercials, like, what is it? It's no means no, yes means yes, maybe means no. It's all the things that we're taught, the buzzwords, the gimmicks, they're all verbal. People do not have sex that way. I write in length about the number of studies into this, that primarily people communicate with body language. There's you get into socialization and how the different genders are socialized to behave in these situations. I guess what I'm getting at is, we've been teaching kids, teenagers and young adults, about sex in a way that is not actually conducive to what happens in real life. And I think it's setting up for a lot of confusion. And there's also some research that shows that, men are perfectly good at understanding body language. But there is a lot of research that also shows that if you're in a good mood, you're more likely to think that someone's into this, that men are more likely to view social interactions as sexual than women. Like, it's just, and then you throw alcohol in there, which is just very common in a lot of alleged sexual assault situations. And it's just like a petri dish of awful. And so I think Aziz Ansari is a great area to look at this issue of complicated consent, that from Aziz's perspective, if this played out the way that she suggested, verbally, he's doing everything right. He's listening. She says no, he stops. He's like, that's all happening. But it's about, is he paying attention to her body language in a correct way? And I think that what we can do is we can read that, and we can learn from it, and think about how we want to change sex education going forward to take that into account.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, what do you think would be a superior kind of, not only sex education in general, because that's a broad topic, but the consent education? How do you think this should be done better after doing this research into the science?
Well, there's a really amazing activist, educator, feminist woman in Toronto who does a lot of training everywhere in Canada, named Farah Khan. And she did this amazing training at Frosh at Queen's University in Ontario. And I went along to it. And her whole thing is, she talks about consent from the position of pleasure. So normally when you think of consent, like things that come to mind are like, don't get arrested, don't rape someone. Like that's what consent is. And from her perspective, it's like, well, what if we just flip it a little bit and we talk about consent as making sure that your partner's into this and really being focused on their body language because you want to be a good sexual partner and flipping it to be positive. And I thought that that was like a pretty amazing idea. I think that there's some challenges in figuring out how to roll that out in the education system, but that I thought was great. And then the other thing, taking all of the onus off of women, right? So I think you hear a lot, like when young women go off to school, like stick with your girlfriends, like don't let any girlfriend out of your sight. Like if she's too drunk, like don't let her go home with someone, blah, blah, blah. And Farah was talking about like, we have to care about the women in our lives, but we also have to care about the men. If your male friend is out with a girl or a guy and, you know, they've had a lot to drink and they're thinking of going home, maybe pull them aside and say, you know what, man, like now's not like, let's just leave it for tonight. Like, let's go get some pizza instead. And caring about kind of everybody and recognizing that, especially with alcohol, like I'm not trying to shame people for drinking or anything like that or drug and hookups, but there is naturally room for problems in that situation and just being really vigilant about it. So I think, you know, reframing the discussion around to be what if pleasure is a really interesting way to think of consent in differently. And again, understanding that we need to stop talking about consent as purely a verbal transaction and need to acknowledge and make people think about looking for body language cues. There's this video, that you've probably seen, consent, it's simple as tea. And it's like, you know, do you want tea? Yes, great, you have some tea. If someone's passed out, don't pour tea down their mouth. And it seems really simple, but again, and actually the teenagers that I interviewed at Queen's University, they'd all seen this video. They could recite the legal definition, like the actual legal definition of consent. But not one of them said that they really focused on that during their encounters because it was awkward to talk about.
Yeah. Your Unfounded series at the Globe started, it's been a few years now, right?
I know, I don't know what happened.
Yeah,
it's like suddenly
flies.
like 4 years later or something.
Yeah. So this, like in Canada, I think this is as close to like a journalistic triumph as you can have. I mean, as reporters, like you don't really expect governmental entities to act on your stories, even if they're really good stories that expose malfeasance, wrongdoing, whatever. After stonewalling Robyn for a while she was in which she found that many police forces were dismissing a really high percentage of sexual assault allegations as baseless or unfounded. After the series came out, it was like this, you know, it seemed like a tidal wave, like all the, you know, people were pledging change, police chiefs were like calling you up out of the blue. Yeah. And so that was amazing. And I wonder, like, you know, it's been, you know, 3-4 years, how much better or not better has it gotten as a result?
So, I don't know yet is the honest answer to that. I'm going to revisit Unfounded. I'm going to give them, so one of the challenges when I was doing the reporting, I guess it's really key to point out if you're listening from home, the Unfounded. Unfounded is a like really awkward, unspecific term, but it basically means someone has reported a sexual assault, the police have investigated it, and they say this sexual assault didn't happen. It's not that they're saying, I can't prove it. It's not that they're saying we can't charge someone. It's that I've investigated it. This did not happen. They are either making it up or they are confused. Didn't happen. And the 20% is right off the top. And then after that, there is the chunk that don't result in a charge. So 20% is like crazy high. You know, basically every study suggests the false reporting rate is somewhere between 3 and 8%. You know, sometimes it gets high as 10 or 11. 20 was also the average. There were 100 and I think 115 communities in Canada that I found that had more than 33% just knocked off as unfounded. There's one city in our Maritimes that had a 50% unfounded rate. Like it was just nuts. And it's what is happening here? And on top of that, when I actually like investigated specific cases, police were, doing a bad job on all sorts of sexual assault cases, whether they were unfounded or not. And why was that? Like, why? I thought that was, the core of what the case, the investigation was. Like, why are they doing this? Police, I'm sure, are not inherently trying to be like, we're just trying to let rapists off. And this is where we get into rape myths and stereotypes. And rape myths and stereotypes is this kind of poison that infiltrates society, but also the judicial system. You can have all the laws in the world, but they're not going to be enforced as long as we still have these myths hanging around. And like, let's talk about some of them. I found cases that stuck to a very traditional view of, a woman who was sexually assaulted by a stranger. There was no alcohol. They were not dating. This was, she was on her way to Sunday school. That one's fake. But those cases were handled very well. But cases that were more gray, there was alcohol, maybe they had a sexual past, maybe she consented to some activity, but not all. Like, these cases were very poorly investigated. These are what this kind of what I talk about, rape culture, where we're blaming victims. I found police were not well educated on trauma. Trauma is a really controversial subject in the United States, in particular. That hasn't really come here. I have a whole chapter about that in the book. These, especially in colleges and universities, this kind of idea of the neurobiology of trauma is kind of being attacked as incomplete science. This idea that if you're being raped, you'll freeze and or that you won't be able to remember it. And in the college context, people are being kicked out of school because someone's come forward and said this, and their lawyer brings out university of trauma or neurobiology of trauma, et cetera. One of the things that I think was interesting to me is there's actual, like, this is not questionable. There's one case that I looked at. Actually, there's a very famous scientist not far from Toronto. There was a large car accident, and they did scans of a person's brain after the accident, when they're reliving, they're making them remember what the accident was like. And one of the things that they saw was the part of the brain responsible for speech went offline. Like, that's just one example, but there's lots of actual research that shows that trauma alters the way that a person behaves. And I think that was something that Canadian police were very not aware of. I do want to be clear, when the neurobiology of trauma discussion comes up, how I position it in the book, and certainly my own opinion on it, is that it's not a reason to automatically believe a complainant, but it's a reason to not automatically dismiss a complainant. If they're acting in a way that you don't think makes sense, there might be an actual biological response. Why didn't they run? Why didn't they scream? There's someone right outside the door. Why is that? So I spend a lot of time in the book unpacking the science, the proven science behind the neurobiology of trauma and how that plays in. So police were not aware of a lot of this. So to get back to your question, because I went like really on a big tour there.
Tour away.
There's been a lot of training after the series came out. Police services, as you mentioned, did really quickly change their tune. I actually was very surprised. It happened within a couple of days, because once one started to go, they all started to go. They said that one of the challenges was that there wasn't the right statistical codes that they needed to keep track of cases. They wanted more options. So yeah, I'm going to revisit it in 5 years after they've had time, because I don't want to do it right now and have them again say look, we just didn't have time to deal with the statistical changes. So anecdotally, I think I have seen large improvements. But I also get emails, sometimes a couple times a week, sometimes a couple times a month, from people who are asking me to look into their case because it's been mishandled. And it just, it comes back to this idea of, until we all confront these biases that we have inside, it's going to be challenging. And sexual assault cases are really challenging. That's the other thing. And I'll try to stop talking in a second, but the other big point of the book for me is that we've got to stop looking at the judicial system as the answer to this, because the justice system is always going to be difficult. At least in Canada, and I think the States is very similar, although the laws differ in different parts of the States, but you'd rather have 1,000 guilty people go free than one innocent person go to jail. Like, that's just kind of the foundation of the justice system. That's why the bar to incarcerate someone is so high. And so it's just not the place that you're going to get the outcomes that you want.
Yeah, I could ask you so many questions about Unfounded, but I think we're almost at the audience Q&A. So I'll pivot to current events. It's amazing. I mean, it's not at all amazing, but so many prominent politicians in both Canada and the US have had Me Too situations, to put it broadly, from Trudeau. President Biden had to address a sexual assault allegation, general allegations of touching people improperly. And we just had a Governor Cuomo of New York, resign over Me Too, assault allegations. I could ask you so much about Cuomo. I think one thing that was interesting was the way he attempted to defend himself before his resignation. He released a kind of slideshow, maybe it was actually a slideshow, with photo after photo of him like hugging, touching, kissing people he was not.
He's providing his own evidence to the crowd for everyone.
Yeah.
Here's the dossier against me.
Yeah, and as well as photos of others, like, previous presidents hugging hurricane victims. And the argument was basically like, look, I'm an Italian American, I'm a touchy guy, I was raised touchy, everyone hugs and kisses, it's normal. I don't know. What did you think watching that?
I mean, Cuomo was really interesting. I just saw someone talk about The Body Keeps the Score, which is a great book, highly recommend. It's cited heavily in my book. And I interviewed Bessel. Okay, Cuomo. So what was really interesting to me about that, watching it, from my side of the border, was you could see that this was the end for him. I'm curious if it would have been the end if the nursing home situation had also not happened as well. But he really leaned into, I mean, when Joe Biden had his allegation, he kind of said, it's something very similar. Like, I've always been kind of like an affectionate guy. Yeah. And Cuomo, I thought, tried to play that as well. The problem with Cuomo was that, with Joe Biden, there's one person here. And with Cuomo, there's, a dozen, right? And it's interesting because on one hand, I think there is something to be said about, can you judge the past with today's lens, right? And I do think that in the interest of reality and moving forward, there is a difference. But again, there's a spectrum. It's always been bad to rape someone, right? Like, and different types of behavior plays out different on the spectrum depending on the era. So with Cuomo, like, this stuff is very recent, right? Like, that we're talking about here. So let's say that, 30 years ago, someone was saying like, he, put his hand on my back, or he said, hey, you, and touched my spine. I think that would play differently than something happening currently. And the other thing was, when you read the allegations against him, like, it just seemed like he was so aware of the power, and allegedly, this has not been proven, but there was an obvious power imbalance that he seemed to be exploiting in these situations. And obviously that the trooper was just like the most mind-blowing to me, that this is someone who is protecting you and they are feeling attacked. But yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And I thought it was interesting that he tried to kind of like, to survive it, lean into that, playing on, I think, a lot of people's fears of, well, maybe I've done something in the past, am I going to get canceled? When actually, like, this isn't the past for him. This is the present. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that he came down because of it.
I was always curious about how the sexual assault allegations against former President Trump were treated by the public and by the media, because they eventually numbered in the dozens. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people with dozens of sexual assault allegations against them, like, they, if there was some other guy, they might be described as like disgraced, or that fact might be in every story about them. Like John Smith, who's been accused of sexual assault by 34, I think it's more than 34. With Trump, he was defeated. He didn't can't say survive, but I think that stuff just kind of faded into the background after he aggressively denied all of it. I'm wondering, like, what did you make of the media and I guess broader handling of allegations against Trump?
With Trump, I mean, ultimately, society is comfortable with the idea of a very successful businessman pushing far with women. I think is all like it actually like helps his brand. That's it's a trope that I'm investigating some developers right now. Don't tell anybody, but and I was going through with some old articles about this, and it was like a glowing review. This is, going back some decades, but that this man really liked his women, just like stated as a fact. That there's lots of pictures of like, blondes hanging off of him, and he's got a cigar. And, this is not that long ago. Like, this is in my lifetime that this was out there. And so for Trump, that plays into it. And then compounding with the fact that he's also a person, and I think that we experienced this when covering Rob Ford, who isn't going to care about maintaining their dignity, right? Like, they'll show up and have the whole world think they're a slime ball.
Yeah,
and
like shamelessness as a
shameless. It's shameless as if you're willing to go there, you can survive a lot. And like, that's what's interesting about Cuomo is like, he ultimately wanted to maintain some dignity and not be impeached, and be, paraded Cersei Lannister style through the street. So I think that is with Trump. I mean, yeah, it was never going to matter, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And depressing.
One thing I was curious about in the book was some of the stuff you said that that was echoed by Donald Trump and people like Trump. Like, when you talk about the discussion of Me Too issues, at one point you lament people being unwilling to speak their mind because they're afraid of being branded unwoke. You lament what you call call out culture, which I think most people would now call cancel culture. And so you're admired by a lot of people on the left in Canada, Canadian feminists, but this is stuff that honestly, like, you hear similar stuff from Trump and Republicans. Do you still feel that way, and why do you feel that way about the state of the discussion of these issues?
So, I mean, I'm not opposed to calling people out. Like, I think it's such, I mean, everything around Me Too is like, even when I'm having this conversation now, I'm like, make sure you phrase this correctly, because if it comes out the wrong way, it's easy to parcel off. But I think, go a roundabout way here, I think a person has a right to call out someone who's done something wrong to them, right? Like, that's my right. I can speak my truth. The person that I'm calling out has the right to defend themselves, right? Like, it's this discord that's kind of the deal. I think since I've written the book too, I mean, certainly when I was writing the book, I was feeling very much like with Me Too, it would be really beneficial if we could have some more nuanced discussions about this stuff, and that people are jumping really quickly to conclusions sometimes. And then when the book came out in Canada, I was doing tours and talking a lot to people about cancel culture. And, I think I've evolved a little on it. One woman I was sitting with who's was really great, was talking about just and she's a prominent Black writer in Canada, was saying, it's difficult for you as a white woman to lament call out culture, because you're not taking into account the power imbalance there, that it's easier for you. This is a platform that so many people have never had access to. And of course that's true. I mean, Me Too started because of social media, right? Like, this whole movement would not have happened without social media. This accountability is only possible because of that. I went back in the book and looked at, some prominent coverage of sexual assault trials in Canada before social media, but not that far in the distance. This is like, when I'm in university, and, mainstream newspapers were gatekeeping who would have those discussions. And they were, very oh my gosh, there was the National Post is another national newspaper in Canada. There's two, and I think it was something like it's the odds of a man, a white man, getting a fair trial in a sexual assault case is something around Nazi Germany. It was, just they went there. That was the level of discourse. So there is huge benefit to social media and how this is played out. And so my views have evolved a little more sympathetically, for sure, understanding that, that it is ultimately for sure a net good. And at the same time, I still would love us, I think like all of us, to give people a little bit more space to grow and being okay with people growing, because ultimately, like, if we don't give people space to grow, then we're not, like, what are we even doing? We're just kind of hanging out here in the dirt. So, yeah.
No, that was a good answer. Okay, I'm gonna ask you some audience questions.
Okay.
Audience, you can put your question in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many as possible. So Robyn, we have from anonymous attendee, they ask, will you revisit your unfounded reporting in smaller municipalities to see if there have been improvements? The data you reported in my home of St. John, New Brunswick was deeply concerning, and I worry about whether there will be improvements without reporting/pressure.
Yeah, St. John I will never forget the day that I opened St. John's. I think it was 54% unfounded rate, or St. John, not St. John's, which is Newfoundland. It's different. No, I will be, for sure. There are, one of the strengths of the series that we did was I looked at every single police jurisdiction in Canada. There were 1,100 and change of them at the time. And so when we go back, we will absolutely do a full comprehensive review of every police jurisdiction, including St. John.
Valerie Michaud asks, where do you feel restorative justice fits into the grand scheme of justice for sexual assault survivors?
So restorative justice is, I think, a really important place to explore, which is this idea of, is it best for society to lock someone up? Can we reach a resolution here a different way? So yeah, I think there's a couple things. Obviously, in my reporting, I think jail is always a very extreme result. And there are people who belong in jail. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be, but we also have to remember that people come out of jail at some point, and they're re-entering society? Is that the best thing for society for them to spend time in jail? You got to make all those calculations. So as much as possible, I think if there's another way, if there's a way to avoid that, to take away in someone's freedom, then I think that's a good thing. A lot of the sexual assault complainants that I've interviewed in my reporting, it was important for them to be heard. Many wanted an apology, or more than that, an acknowledgement of what happened. Like, so much, like, over and over again. And I don't want to speak for everyone, because, I've interviewed, I don't know, probably about like 100 women now, and some men, but which is not a huge sample when you're considering the tens of thousands of people that are sexually assaulted every year. But that was very common. They don't want to be gaslit, right? And so I think there is a huge avenue there. But again, I will reinforce this idea that the justice system is not the best place to actually make changes. I think it's really got to be in the education system. I think even in the culture we're consuming right now, there's been so many great new models for behavior. The morning show, if you watch the morning show, there was this great scene with Steve Carell. I think it's Martin Short he's talking to, but they talk about the issues from the perspective of an offender, and like those kind of conversations that you never see 10, 15 years ago. Like, so the culture evolving, entertainment culture that I think are all really positive. And the key is really, like, not to be basic, but it's better sexual health education.
Rory Sullivan asked two questions about the justice system, so I will put both to you and you can answer them how you see fit. He says, I agree with you in terms of body language and sex education, but can we use body language in the justice system? And Rory Sullivan also says, love the book. Given the challenges with consent, do you think our justice system can be dramatically reformed, or is this generally the best we can do in a system based on guilt beyond a reasonable doubt?
I mean, it's a great question. So I don't know if you're in the United States or Canada. In Canada, it's actually really interesting I didn't mention this before, but I'm glad you prompted me. In Canada, the justice system doesn't look at words, actually. You have to indicate yes. So it's a really common thing I found in police investigations was police were very fixated on, did you say no? What did you do to indicate no? And actually the law in Canada is you have to indicate yes. So the accused person has to be able to demonstrate that they knew the complainant was consenting. And how is that? And what they will take body language into account. There's a very famous case, though, that has established a lot of our consent laws in Canada, where the woman did nothing. She basically didn't move. And there was an argument that that's consenting. And I actually went to the Supreme Court, and that's not enough. Complete immobility. And she argued, of course, that she was young. This man had kind of put her in a trailer. He was much older. I think it was a job interview that she had been there for, and she was terrified that he was going to hurt her. And actually, he had many offenses, and that her complete stillness was not enough. So, and I don't remember the last part of the question. Let me try to bring it up to the. Is this generally the best we can do in a system beyond? Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of what I'm saying. Like the bar is beyond reasonable doubt. We want that bar to be high, though. Like I am not someone who, when I'm doing all this reporting and talking, when I'm complaining about police closing 20% of cases as unfounded, I'm not saying they need to be jailing all of those people. They need to be charging all of those people. It's about, you didn't even do an investigation. You didn't interview. These are cases being closed before they interviewed witnesses, before they looked at forensic tests, before they tried to find surveillance footage, like didn't take crime scene photos. These are like really basic things. A person who complains of sexual assault, you owe them a thorough investigation, and then you make a determination. We want the bar to be high in court to incarcerate someone, to take away someone's liberty. But we also want to understand that these issues are really complicated. And just because someone is found not guilty in court doesn't mean something wrong didn't happen. And if in the interest of getting better, we need to understand what happened to try to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, like reading the book and reading the Unfounded reporting, I think the thing that made me least hopeful, even with the promises of change, was like the extent to which there was no, like not even the most basic investigative steps in some of these cases. And it made me wonder, like, can this really be fixed with training? Like someone not even interviewing witnesses, not even collecting the surveillance footage, or is this just
not interviewing the alleged perpetrator?
Yeah, like is this just like deeply ingrained like misogyny, sexism? Can this be fixed with a better model or better training? I don't know if there's an answer to that. Someone, an anonymous attendee asks, where do people like Anthony Weiner and Jeffrey Toobin, who, full disclosure, is my CNN colleague, fall on the spectrum? You familiar with the Toobin case? Yeah. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So I don't want to talk about Toobin and be weird for you, but that's weird, right? Like we can just, yeah. Like, I mean, I think there's a case, this is not, I don't want to equate this, but like there's a member of parliament in Canada who has twice been caught with his shirt off on his Zoom, right? Like in the parliamentary Zoom that the public has access to. And it's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, what's up with that? How does that happen twice? He might have even been fully naked once, now that I think back. But anyway, I think he was going to the bathroom. Anyway, he came from a run. I'm going on to this too long. I guess there's a spectrum is what I'm talking about here. So icky man behavior is where I'd put those things that fall. And I think there's a real embarrassment, like with Toobin, for example. Anthony Weiner is just like, what do you even say about that guy? But I'm sure that was the most probably horrifically embarrassing, awful thing that's ever happened to that man. And that might be fair, right? Like that's a fair punishment, is to be the absolutely the most embarrassed you've ever been in your life. And that will always, when you Google, that's always going to be there. And I think sometimes having something come out and the discussion that comes around is an appropriate punishment for that.
I would be shocked if you answered this frankly, but an attendee asked, are you investigating serious allegations against any prominent Canadians right now?
About sexual assault? No. But yeah, I'm always investigating serious allegations against prominent Canadians. This country's not super big, and there's not that many media outlets, and there's certainly not that many investigative reporters at at those outlets. So yeah, subscribe to the Globe and Mail. We're shining light in dark places.
That was very good. And this will be the last audience question. It's from Blair Kerrigan, who asks, will eliminating the gender power gap within both the judicial and enforcement communities be a step forward in making the changes required?
I don't know if this is a plant was this from my mother or not? The Power Gap is the name of the series that I did earlier this year. So this was kind of something that I didn't mean to kind of make like an Unfounded part 2, but what I did was in doing so much of my reporting on Unfounded and then writing a book on Me Too, I'm thinking a lot about power and power imbalance, because I think that's a root of a lot of things. And, why is it that there's still sexual harassment in the workplace? Well, that's because there's this power imbalance that exists, and it plays out in all sorts of different ways, including the fact that women are paid much less than men for equal work and are much less likely to be promoted. So I looked at the Canadian workforces and did a lot of fun data stuff to just look at the different levels of women and different in public entities at different career placements, salary bands, et cetera. I think it'll make a huge difference. With Unfounded, we found that police services that had a higher proportion of female police officers had fewer unfounded cases. Now, is that because the women are there's less unfounded cases, or is it because the police service is in general better at more equitable policing behavior? And so those two things happen at the same time. I don't know, but that's true. So I think that for sure, when we have better representation at different power levels, that's kind of the key to it. And it's of course not just around gender. It's also in all sorts of different measures of diversity. In my Power Gap reporting, I found that, of course, women were dramatically outnumbered by almost every measure at the top, but also in the pipeline, on the way to the top, at all sorts of different management levels. But of the very few number of women who did make through, they were almost all white women. I think, oh my gosh, I think it was something like 43 out of 1,000 women that were in the top 1% of earners were women of color. And you couldn't even break it down beyond that because the numbers were so small. So better representation is important. And also then empowering people at different management levels to actually make change is the next step. So yes, Power Gap, bad, must close, will fix other things. But that's hard too. And that's where, all these myths and stereotypes and biases impact that as well. So I think talking about it is important. Giving people some space to grow is really important. Not looking to the justice system to solve all our problems is really important, and interrogating our own views. And, none of us are perfect, and just being really okay to get into the muck yeah. Thanks so much for doing this, Daniel. It's been so lovely to talk to you.
Great talking to you. I'm going to turn it back over to Politics and Prose.
Yeah, great moderating, Daniel. And Robyn, it's so amazing how your newspaper series led to such improvements in policing. And now your book hopefully will enable much better understanding and more productive discussion of what remains the vitally important and complex issue of sexual assault. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Had It Coming. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well,